An informed and engaged electorate is the cornerstone of any representative democracy. Yet increasingly, our democracy is threatened by general voter apathy. How do we get people to re-engage in the political process? We'll ask Alex Padilla, the California Secretary of State, and Mindy Romero, head of the California Civic Engagement Project at the UC Davis Center for Regional Change. Democracy at risk. Voter registration and turnout really do matter.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world, and by Kaiser Permanente. Thrive, from the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute. It's the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. The California Civic Engagement Project is a nonpartisan civic engagement, research, and outreach initiative with UC Davis. The key focus is identifying disparities and opportunities in civic participation. Its founder and director, Mindy Romero, is our guest today. Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's get an overview on the percentages of voting age eligible Californians that are actually registered to vote.
That are registered to vote. Well, first off, registration rates are pretty low, actually, in California, I think, compared to what most people would expect. And there are pretty big disparities across groups, so not everybody registers at the same rates. So we'll say that at the outset. So right now, currently, registration rates are actually a little bit lower than we typically see. They're about 71% or so for the entire population. And then when we look at subgroups, Latinos are just under 60%, young people are around 50%, those age 18 to 24, Asian Americans around 50%. So we see big gaps in just people's ability to vote based on registration.
Because it's a presidential election year and everything that's going on, are you seeing more registrations increase?
Yeah, so the story's a little complicated. So actual rates are a little bit lower for most groups than we saw 4 years ago at the same time. But we've seen this big surge in registration. And I think what's happening is certainly people are motivated, people are thinking about the election. They started registering early in this cycle than we normally see. They registered in January, February, March, when normally we see a surge in maybe April, May. But it's just simply that registration rules have been cleaned up a little bit since 4 years ago. And of course, we've also had population increases since 4 years ago. So we are seeing more registered voters. But rates, so it's just more of a complicated story when we look at rates.
Let's talk about, after you register, you have to vote. So what is the percentage of voting age Californians that are actually voting?
The percentage of voting age. So let's talk about eligible. So those are adult citizens, right? Those that are by age and by citizenship. In 2014, which was a record low turnout, we saw only 31% of eligible voters that were actually voted. Wow. And in that record low turnout year, we should note that it was much lower for historically underrepresented groups. So Latinos, their turnout rate was only 17%, Asian Americans as a group, 18%. Those 18 to 24, only 8% was their eligible.
8%?
8.2% of eligible 18 to 24-year-olds in California actually voted. Wow. That was 285,000 out of the 3.5 million.
So you're kind of touching on this already, but what are the big demographic differences between voters and non-voters?
So that's a really great question. They're big. Overall, when you look at the pie of voters, those are actually voting in any given election, whether it's high turnout or low turnout, it doesn't look like the rest of the population as a whole, even the eligible voter population. And it looks very different from the population of non-voters. So the voting population, well, let me look at the non-voter population. It's probably a little more easier to dissect. And that's really who we want to target. So of those that are non-voters, about 7 million are eligible in California, but not registered. And about 60 to 70% are Asian and Latino combined. Young people are overrepresented amongst non-voters. Low-income folks from low educational backgrounds are also overrepresented.
So basically what you're saying is it's the older, frankly white, homeowners are the kind of people that are voting, and it's the renters and under 45 are not voting.
Flip side is our voting electorate is older, whiter, wealthier, more educated, yes, also more likely to have a home, much more likely than the rest of.
So why are minority and youth rates and low-income worker rates so low, participation rates so low?
There's lots of reasons. First off, there are elements of our registration system, how our electoral system is designed, that we know from much research and from just voter data year after year, election after election, that shows that there are barriers to participating. And then there's the whole motivation question and the outreach question. So we know, for instance, registration, by those lower registration rates I just mentioned a moment ago, registration is less accessible for folks that are lower income, for folks of color, and they also get less outreach, less mobilization from campaigns that see them as not likely voters. And so
it's kind of a feeds on itself.
It becomes a vicious cycle. And then there's also this whole question about feeling disconnected from the political process. Right. So you're talking, first off, about historically underrepresented groups that don't have the history or the connection. And then on top of that, our political environment, I think everybody, by and large, is having an issue with wondering how their vote matters.
Right, and there's a cynicism about the political process, probably.
And underrepresented groups wonder that even more.
Let me ask this last question. Some folks say, fine, why should we care? If these people don't care enough to vote, why should we care if they vote or not?
We should definitely care. The strength of our democracy, I'll give you the democracy answer, then I'll give you the practical, even more practical reason. Right now, by just looking at voter turnout rates, the state of our democracy is weak, period. It's weak in the U.S. compared to the voter turnout rates of other established democracies. We are by far one of the lowest in the world. California has one of the lowest turnout rates in the nation. And then you look at some of these underrepresented groups, even lower. So we're the low of the low in that sense. But why should people vote? It's not just about the individual voice, which is important, that you feel like you had a say, right? No. But for policymakers, for decision makers, they need to hear from everyone, not just some people. They're making very important decisions that affect the entire state. And right now, as it stands, with low turnout rates and low participation and those uneven rates by group, they're only hearing from some Californians. How are they possibly able to make good, informed decisions that help everyone?
I'm going to leave that as a rhetorical question. I want to thank Mindy Romero with UC Davis for explaining the voter registration and turnout rates. But before they can vote, they have to be registered. How do we increase voter registration? A conversation with California's Secretary of State Alex Padilla next. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome. The state's age-eligible voters seem to be disinterested and disengaged almost at epic proportions. So if we're going to change course, the first thing we have to do is get more people to register to vote. And that's been the focus of our next guest, the California Secretary of State, Alex Padilla. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So recently, though, there's been a dramatic uptick in registrations. What are the numbers and why is it happening?
Well, I think there's both good news to share, both short-term as well as long-term. Short-term, it's clear to pretty much everybody that this is an election year, and among the things that we'll be voting on is a new president of the United States. So that has a lot more people paying attention, excited about the upcoming election, energized, and we're seeing it in our voter registration numbers, including but not limited to the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that have gone to registertovote.ca.gov to register to vote or to update their registration.
We were talking earlier about those numbers. Those numbers are pretty dramatic. Over 1 million hits?
Yeah, nearly 1.8 million people since the first of the year through the deadline to register May 23rd for the June election, either to register for the first time or to update their registration.
Yeah, I've been reading that they're calling it historic, the growth in registration, so that's a good thing. Things are changing. Now, one of the things that happened back in January was the passage of this Motor Voter Act. It's supposed to increase voter registration by making it easier to register. How does the process work, and when is it going to be fully implemented?
Right. So last year, the legislature passed, and the governor signed the California New Motor Voter. So this is good news in forward years, not for 2016. But what we're going to be able to do once this is implemented is systematically register voters that are eligible when they're applying for or renewing a driver's license or state ID through the DMV.
A twofer.
It's a twofer. It's government efficiency.
Government efficiency, right.
At its finest. But think about how many millions of Californians go through the DMV each and every year that are sharing their name, their address, their date of birth, their signature, all the same information required when you register to vote. So if we know you're eligible, we can register you to vote in the process, which is, I think, going to be good for democracy.
Is it automatic voter registration?
It's automatic voter registration. We do have freedom of speech in this country. You have the right to not be a voter if you so choose. So we do give people the opportunity to opt out. But the default is, if we know you're eligible, you'll be added to the voter rolls.
So how does it? Oregon also has something similar. How's California's different than Oregon's?
Yeah, that's a good question. Oregon was the first state in the nation to adopt an automatic registration law, and the way they're implementing it is, they do an analysis on all the transactions, right, all the interfaces with DMV, and for people who they know are eligible, they send them a letter and they say, unless we hear from you otherwise, we're going to add you to the voter rolls. And by the way, can you tell us, who your political party preference is and that sort of thing? We're going to be able to do that all at the transaction itself, at the counter, if you will, when you're at the DMV, or if you're renewing your driver's license by mail using those same forms. So it's going to be more seamless. It's going to be a little bit less expensive for us to implement and hopefully more effective.
Yeah, it seems more efficient. You're doing it right when they're there and not waiting till after they leave. So there's also, this law was passed in 2013 about people in the country legally allowing them to obtain a California driver's license. So how do you ensure that they aren't mistakenly registered when they're at DMV?
Good. Well, it's important to remember that we've been required by federal law for decades now to offer a voter registration opportunity at the DMV. It's a federal law known as Motor Voter. And so when we passed what's known as AB 60, affording undocumented individuals an opportunity to have a driver's license, we built into the procedures there a firewall, if you will. If they can't prove citizenship, they're not even afforded an opportunity to register to vote. And so we just got to keep those same protocols, those same firewalls, if you will, in place through the electronic version, which is what we call New Motor Voter.
Yeah, and I think that law you're referring to is back in 1993, so the federal law. So that's been around for quite some time, but taken a while to actually, something happen here in California, apparently. They say that voting is a learned activity. There's some people actually talking about maybe we should lower the voting age to 16. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. Either just that it's a learned activity and we need to get young people more engaged earlier, or lowering the voting age.
So I do think it is a learned activity. Most people will register, when their parents have shown them the way, or, for high school students, if their friends are excited and engaged, they'll kind of influence each other. We don't have right now in California, the law, the legal age to register to vote is 18 years or older. Right. There's been a conversation about should we lower that threshold, and I think we've taken a half step there by allowing pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds.
What does that mean, pre-registration?
So pretty soon, if you're 16 years old, you'll be able to fill out that voter registration form, turn it in, and the county will sort of process that and hold that registration until the time of your 18th birthday.
So you're on the rolls.
And then you're automatically on the rolls. You don't have to worry about it when you're 18. You can get
happy
excited.
birthday. You get to vote. You get to be on jury duty.
Or even better than jury duty. What we do allow here in California is for 16 and 17-year-olds to work as student poll workers. Most counties need the help. Young people tend to have a lot of energy and are more likely to be bilingual. So when it comes to assisting voters with languages other than English, and they can get paid.
Great experience. Thank you for talking about how we increase voter registrations. Up next, getting voters to register is one part of the equation. The other half of the equation is getting them to vote. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with California Secretary of State Alex Padilla. First, understand that California has its own voter Bill of Rights. What should Californians know about their voting rights?
Well, I think it's a point of pride for California elections officials that while there's a Federal Voting Rights Act that we just celebrated 50th anniversary of it last year, it's a subject of debate and fight in other parts of the country where they're changing the rules on registration, changing the rules on how you can cast a ballot. I think in California we pride ourselves in going above and beyond what those minimal protections are for the right to vote. It's the most fundamental right.
It's interesting. In the rest of the country, they're making it more difficult to vote, and in California, making it easier to vote. It seems to be.
Exactly, and I'm proud of that, because if you're eligible to vote, if you're 18 years or older and a citizen, there should be nothing unnecessary in your way between you and being able to register. That's why we can do it on paper, we can do it online in California, and being able to vote.
Yeah, so if we get people to register to vote, now we got to get them to vote. What are some of the cognitive barriers to voting?
No, I think as far as what's in place today, and then we can talk about proposals on how to make it better in the future, we ensure things like if you have a language preference other than English, you have the ability to get your voting and elections information in your language of preference. You can sign up or make that modification on your voter registration record and get the materials in that way. Things like just making sure you know where your polling place is, easy ways to look that up, what the hours are, options, you can vote by mail, you can vote in person, all those fundamental rights that you should be aware of as a voter so that nobody can impede you.
Right. So what should voters be thinking about if they want to have a smooth election day experience?
It's always good to have a plan, right? That's good life advice.
Right.
And so it is with elections. And so people knowing what their options are in advance. If you want to vote by mail, know that you have that option, know what the process is of requesting a vote by mail ballot, what the deadlines are for getting that ballot in to make sure that it's counted. But if you're going to plan on going on election day, make sure you know what time on election day you're going to go. 7 a.m. the polls open, 8 p.m. the polls close. Far too often we hear people get caught up in traffic you know,
cutting it too close and
left work too late, that sort of thing. But also know that if you're in line at 8 o'clock, even though you haven't cast your ballot, you have the right to wait as long as it takes for you to get that ballot, cast it on your time frame. You're allowed the right to vote.
So we can avoid all of that by mail-in voting, right? We can avoid all those problems.
And more than 60% of Californians do.
Yeah, but I was wondering, you know, Oregon has an all mail-in voting system. Should we adopt that?
And so here we are as far as like what our ideas and proposals are for making voting easier in the future. Oregon, Washington has all vote-by-mail only elections. And I think their turnout is up since they've adopted that reform. I think California is a much bigger, more diverse state, and we have people who have just different preferences. And so I proposed to the legislature that we allow counties to migrate to an election system where every voter gets their ballot in the mail automatically 4 weeks before Election Day, and we give people options on how to get that ballot back in. Through the mail, through ballot drop boxes that people can drop off anywhere in the county that's convenient to them, ballot drop-off stations, or even modernized polling places as we know them to what's referred to as vote centers.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, vote centers and kiosks. Should we get rid of these polling places? Sometimes you got, where's my polling place? And if you just had a center where you knew that's where they're collecting the ballots.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, we're going to have multiple locations in each city, in each county, for people to come in and vote if they want to vote in person. But what we can do is modernize these polling places where we get away from the paper ledger that we're all used to when we vote in person, and use technology, use laptops, have tablets, and have electronic access to the voter list, because what that will do is have each location give each location access to the entire list of voters in the county, not just that neighborhood. So you give the voter the option of voting anywhere in the county that's convenient to them.
That's really important. You don't have to find your polling place. You can go to one of these voting centers and you're on the list.
And it gets better. And have these vote centers open for a week or 2 weeks leading up to the election. So you have options on when, where, and how to cast the ballot.
That would be very different. Let me ask you about online voting. Are we ever going to see that?
Maybe, but no time soon. You know, we have online voter registration, but we don't have online voting for two reasons. Most people will guess the first concern, right? It's security, right? Some form of, is it hackable? You know, what's election integrity? But also from a point of view of privacy. We have a secret ballot in California and in this country. We know who votes. We know who votes by mail versus in person, but we don't know who voted for who. We can't tell the contents of somebody's ballot. And until the internet is built to protect that, we won't see online voting.
What about using technology and social media to kind of encourage, motivate, particularly younger voters?
Right. Absolutely, and I think that's been the reason for a big spike in voter registration this year. You know, more than 1.8 million people going to the online voter registration site to register to vote with a few clicks, as opposed to filling out that paper card.
It's noticeable too. Your office does a lot of social media.
We're trying.
Is that the reason why you're doing it?
Well, we know that as technology evolves, you know, we got to get information out in multiple platforms. We do traditional media, we do public events, we do social media, any and every way possible to get information out to young people and old.
All the above strategy. Well, thanks for discussing how to increase voter turnout. Up next, you know, freedom isn't free. What do we have to do to invest to make our democracy work more efficiently and effectively? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome. We're talking with California Secretary of State Alex Padilla. You know, the cost of making elections work, it takes some money. First, we got to qualify voters. Then you got to qualify ballot measures. And then you got to come up with those detailed voter information guides. How much does all of that cost?
Well, it costs, I can say, in the millions, but I think the real answer is you can't put a price tag on democracy, right? It's the bedrock of our nation, that we're a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and the way that people make their positions and their priorities heard is at the ballot box with our vote. And so, you know, you can imagine the costs involved of securing polling locations and equipment and poll workers. And
you've asked for a little more money recently from the governor and the state legislature, saying, you know, to do this job, I think it was $32 million. What's the chance of that happening?
Well, the good news is the legislature and the governor approved the initial $16 million to make sure that we were ready for the primary election, with the balance of it worked into the budget process for the next fiscal year. So, you know, we budgeted initially for a bump because it's a presidential election year, more voters, more turnout, but the numbers we're seeing so far are above and beyond what we predicted. And so I'm glad the legislature and on a bipartisan basis, and the governor agreed.
Always good on a bipartisan basis. So you know, back in 2000, we saw some things that could happen when things go wrong, when voting counts go awry. There appears to be a growing concern about the age of our voting machines. How old are they, and what is it going to cost to replace them?
Right. So in 2000, we saw what happened in Florida. You know, Bush v. Gore, butterfly ballots, hanging chads. And the good thing is, at a national level, we had a conversation about how not let that happen again. And so Congress acted on a bipartisan basis and provided funding for new voting systems across the country, including California. But for all the counties that bought new equipment in 2002, 2004, 2006, guess what? It's more than a decade old.
Right.
And if it's a decade old, it's built on 15 to 20-year-old technology. And
they're saying some of the like the parts, those machines aren't even built anymore.
Yeah, some machines don't have replacement parts anymore. The warranties have expired. All those sorts of things. So it is time for California to invest in the next generation of voting systems. And I think coupled with, in the last segment, we talked about a new way to conduct elections that it creates convenience and choice for voters. You know, we can take advantage of the opportunity to make an investment in equipment that provides that efficiency and voter choice.
Well, these machines aren't cheap, though. I was reading where I think it said that Maryland has a machine that reads paper ballots on optical scanner. Those are $5,000 a piece, and so you think about a lot of polling places, and it adds up.
I think statewide, if we replace just the kind of equipment that we have today, we're talking $400, maybe $450 million for the entire state. But if we're smart about how we conduct elections in a way that's actually better for voters, we can bring that price tag down.
Yeah, but it's important, right? You want to make sure the votes are counted accurately. So what about this reliable source of funding? Is there a way to kind of make funding more reliable for state offices, your office? Any ideas on how we can make that funding stream something that's more consistent?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's two pieces here. One is the equipment, which thankfully we don't have to buy each and every year. You invest in the voting systems for the state, and you can kind of count on that, at least for the good part of a decade or more. But the year in, year out expenses of outreach to voters, educating voters, every other year, printing sample ballots, and voters' information guides, those just have to be a standard part of the budget. And for the most part, it has been in California, but for a few very tough budget years where we had to get a little creative. But for the equipment piece, the capital expense, it's much more significant. Well, maybe we ought to establish a trust where we can feed into it each and every year so that as it accumulates, when there's a need for investment in new equipment, then it's not a sticker shock for the state budget.
Right. I was thinking about, we're talking about voter participation, registration. Is there a lack of civil literacy in our society? I mean, how can we get Californians to be more focused on politics and policy, particularly like in K through 12? Right.
I mean, as much as I like to think that there isn't this apathy out there, the numbers show otherwise. California ranked 43rd in the nation when it came to turnout in 2014, despite the fact that there's more than 17 million registered voters in California. We know there's another 7 million that are eligible but just haven't registered. So clearly by the numbers, we have some work to do. And I think civic education is a big piece. Just by observation from my travels in the state, it's wonderful when I hear young people say that, they were brought up in a household where their parents talked about what was on the ballot and they took them to the polls in November so they can observe election. They were just kind of brought up with that tradition, with that value. But I know in my household, that wasn't the case. My parents are immigrants to the United States and to California specifically. They didn't take me to go vote every November, not because they didn't want me to have that experience, but they weren't eligible at the time. Right. I mean, from the time they became citizens, they'd never missed an election.
Yeah, but then they became, when you were running for office, I'm thinking they signed up and they voted.
At that point, they did. But
that's
I was
good motivation.
In my 20s. And so I think it just underscores the importance of, yes, we want families to pass it on from generation to generation, but we have to get in there through community organizations and especially through schools to try to make sure all young people are brought up with this information.
I want to thank our guest, California Secretary of State Alex Padilla, for joining us. I also want to thank Mindy Romero, the director of the California Civic Engagement Project at UC Davis. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can follow us on Facebook or Twitter, or you can get our e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.